Welcome everyone to our latest discussion. And today, myself and Bree and Claire, we are very excited to be in conversation with Vic McEwan, who's the artistic director and founding member of the CAD Factory. Welcome, Vic. It's our absolute pleasure to have you here on Heart of the Matter.
Thanks for having me.
Vic's work as an artist, it's incredibly diverse, inclusive, and is most importantly grounded in the lived experience of the community, individuals, and the environments that shape us.
Thanks, Michael. I think award-winning doesn't even come close to doing you justice, Vic. We're absolutely thrilled, and I'm just a little bit intimidated actually by your work. I find it genuinely really quite very moving. So I'll give a little bit more background before we kick off. So for Vic's honours in fine art, he was awarded the University Medal and the Executive Dean's Award for Academic Excellence from Charles Sturt University, and also the 2018 Australian Distinctive Works Prize from the Council for the Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. And now you're working on your doctorate as the first artist to be invited into the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. And I believe your research there is supervised by Dr. Susan Coulson from Health Sciences, Dr. Claire Hooker from Medical Humanities, and Dr. Paul Dwyer from Performance Studies, and it takes place in the Sydney Facial Nerve Service. Actually, I did my undergrad at Sydney Uni, and I did a Performance Studies major and was taught by Dr. Paul Dwyer, and he was absolutely amazing. So it was nice to see his name pop up.
It's a nice connection.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely fascinated by that work that you're doing there at the Sydney Facial Nerve Service. And I'm going to quote now a piece from the journal Rich Life, where it says you are examining the human experience of identity in the face of trauma and ill health through the explorations of our most obvious characterization, the face, while also looking at what impact a contemporary artist might have within the clinical environment. Now, this is really, cutting edge stuff. It is that integration of arts and health that we're really trying to move towards today. So that is fantastic. But in particular, I was really struck and fascinated by that piece that you have created, the facial nerve harp. Which brings such, viscerality to your work. I feel that is quite moving. There is that movement from the face to bridging those nerves to the external, which is just so moving. But we are just skimming the surface here of your work. So perhaps you'd like to take us on a little bit of a journey of what, to you are your career highlights, your motivations, and what has brought you to the point of this absolutely fascinating work.
Thanks very much. And thanks for having me. It's always, I enjoy sharing kind of the history and the work that I'm doing because it also helps me try to understand it myself. And so it's always a great opportunity for me to kind of explore what I'm doing. And so, as was mentioned, I run an arts organization called the CAD Factory, and I'm the artistic director of that organization. And, we started back in 2004 in Sydney in a city warehouse running what were at the time illegal gigs and exhibitions. And so, it had a very different beginning a long time ago as a musician in Sydney. And then we moved to regional New South Wales, so to Narrandera, which is about 6 hours drive from Sydney, in between Wagga and Griffith. So it's very, different sort of country. It's farming country, agriculture. And that move really brought with it a massive shift in the sort of work that we did. So in living out there, we, started connecting ourselves to things like water allocation. What water allocation means, something I'd never considered when I lived in the city, and I just went and bought my shopping from the supermarket. Being able to see some of those places just down the road from where we live is Murdering Island on the Murrumbidgee, where over 600 Wiradjuri people were slaughtered at the order of a landholder in the region. And that still sits there as a place that is a historical event, but has a contemporary hold on us and our story. And so, it was a much bigger thing that started impacting our artistic practice. And so it moved very quickly away from this almost hedonistic music existence that we had to actually thinking, there's so much here that is so impacts us in a way that we almost can't help but for our arts practice to move there, to engage with with these stories. And so, it was it wasn't a planned shift, but it was a shift that we just couldn't help. And so being based in that region, we started working with community and working with local schools. And, we are located in an old schoolhouse in Narrandera, and we've since built a number of other studios and facilities there. But, we started off that process by inviting all of the old students that were still alive that lived in our region. Our house was a school from 1886. And so I think the oldest student we found still living was in her 90s. And so we made an installation, and we moved our bedroom out of the schoolhouse and moved up into an unlined shed with our newborn child to present this sort of community story back to the community, as a way of introducing ourselves as well, because there was suspicion of us because we were artists, and why would we move into a town where actually people are moving away from? There's a population drift happening in a lot of our regional centres. And so we delivered that work and saw straight away the really big impact it had on the community. So we had this kind of artistic satisfaction that we had from making the work on our terms as artists, but also understanding that engaging with the sort of ethics of place, the ethics of community, the ethics of stories, untold stories, had a whole other layer of impact on us. And it felt really exciting, and it felt, I don't want to use the word like we felt honored but it felt special, like, wow, what have we accessed here? We're receiving all of this. And so, that sort of continued where we started doing work, say, in the Sunrise Rice Mill. So out there's a Sunrise located out there. And so, which seems a bit odd, thinking that we grow so much rice in drought-stricken region like that. And so that's a complex side story. But, doing a work in the rice mill that shut down in a small town of 600 people where it was the main industry, it shut down because of the drought and then reopened. So working with the workers in the rice mill to explore their place and their town, and understanding what sort of benefits can come from placing an artist within business, not with the aim of sort of addressing business and, financial concerns, but that project, for example, we approached Sunrise and we went through their business plan, and we said things like, in your business plan, you say that you have a commitment to your wider community. What do you do for that? And they didn't do anything. Same about how staff feel, staff cohesion and their sense of them as people as well as employees, but understanding that, maybe not much actually happens for those things. So we really wanted to propose that through the arts, we could actually address these things in a meaningful way. And so, we delivered that project, and then it sort of continued in that manner where we did projects, say, we were commissioned to make a work around the release of the Murray-Darling Basin plan. When that came out, it was, it's still contentious, the management of water in our river systems. When that came out in our region, farmers were burning the plan on the steps of council. So there was lots of anger around it. And so we made, really large work that brought together people with five different people with different relationships to the river system. And so they included an elder who grew up on both the Cumragunja mission on the Murray River and the mission in Darlington Point on the Murrumbidgee River as a child. We brought together a water lawyer who saw water as a tradable commodity. We brought an industrialized farmer who sees, land as being part of a factory floor and it's to extract from. Also an environmental farmer who's trying to rethink some of those methods of using our land. And the person who was the mayor of our town when there was a 10-year drought. And so, doing a project like that had a massive impact on us because, I think really I can sum it up in one comment. So we presented this show in town, 400 or 500 people came to see this 5 different views of the river system where no judgment was placed over them. People's views were just presented. And it was a young child who, from memory, was around 10 years old, who came up to us and said, this is the first time I've seen my dad talk to him without punching him because they have different views on water management. And so, through a project like that, we see not just the fact that these 2 adults actually learn to talk about difference without violence, but a child sees that adults can do that. And that was really kind of profound because we weren't really thinking about social good and we weren't really thinking about those things as being the main drivers. We were thinking about art. But it had a profound shift for us where we realized these things come hand in hand. Inherent in arts practice, because it is also about communication, is the ability to do these things. And so, really that was sort of the shift, I think, that turned my practice and the CAD Factory's practice as an organization really to look at, this historic divide that there has been in the art world that's placed real art and community involved art as being separate things, understanding that divide in the art world has to go. So really what that's developed is, I'm doing all this work in health, for example, but my dream is around the arts being involved in every sector of life. So every portfolio of government, for example, is the way I'm thinking about it at the moment as we're going into having a national cultural policy. It's a great opportunity to think, imagine if the arts policy, the cultural policy we have spoke to the health policy, spoke to infrastructure, spoke to immigration, spoke to defense. That's the dream. That's the big kind of dream. And so I think that's sort of, a quick overview of how we sort of got to this mode of making.
That's fascinating, Vic. And I particularly like the insight that you've got around art being, you're obviously aware of the impact of the environment and the people on your work, but also the impact of the work on the environment and the people around you. And that's something actually I've observed through a lot of your work, even before, you're talking about the exact examples you give, particularly in your work with the Alder Children's Hospital. And that's something at Heart of the Matter we're really interested to hear more about, because it really directly relates to health and arts and how that all interacts together. It's an amazing left of field collaboration. It just introduces so many new perspectives into the biomedical environment, but also, I guess, highlights perspectives that we may not have seen before. Before we dive into the details, can you tell us about how that project came about? What was the thinking behind it? And perhaps a little bit on where the unique project name came from.
So that project became called the Harmonic Oscillator. And so the Harmonic Oscillator is a term from quantum mechanics. And I won't go deeply into the quantum mechanics of it because I don't understand it. However, I'll go into the poetics of it. How about that? And so, it's a term that sort of refers to when a system, and you might think about a human being as a system or however you want to think about it, is displaced, that there's an equal force that brings it back to equilibrium over time. And so you might think about a pendulum in that way. And so, it's felt to me, given that this project was working really deeply in a hospital and in a children's hospital, but also in, the trauma units of a children's hospital, so intensive care. And so, death was a big part of that, for example, and trauma was a massive part of that. This idea that we're not claiming outright that engaging the arts in these environments are going to be the equalizing force, because we also don't want to overstate, the impact of the arts and, its ability to heal everything. But we can contribute to that. We can try to establish the conditions that, as biomedical science looks to certain aspects of this human being's condition, that through the arts we can look at other interrelated aspects of the human condition as well that are really relevant to the experience of their trauma through their health. And so that was why we chose that title, the Harmonic Oscillator. It became a 4 to 5 year project. That title was given to it in the last year. So it was just the project we were doing before that. And so that it came about really, I was awarded the Create New South Wales Regional Fellowship. The first year they had that fellowship. It no longer exists. So I was lucky in the sort of 4 or 5 years it existed to receive the first one. And that did two things. One thing I did was work at the National Museum of Australia for a year as their artist in residence. And also the initial plan was to travel to the UK, I think it was 4 times, to work in Alder Children's Hospital. And so the start of that, the reason why that became something we wanted to do was, firstly, because I'd met Clive Parkinson, who's a sort of arts and health leader, international leader, based in Manchester at Manchester Metropolitan Uni. And I'd met him at an arts and health conference in Sydney, and we got on really well. So we became friends very quickly. And so, we started talking about, I started talking to him about my interest in working with sounds in hospital spaces. So I had come across all this medical research that tells us that the sound levels in hospital aren't meeting the World Health Organization's recommendations for sound, and that the medical research shows us that the sound levels are causing increases in medication, increases in length of hospital stay, increases in stress, lack of sleep, etc. And so the project really developed because I'm an artist who had an interest in sound. A large portion of my practice is sound based, not all of it, but a large portion of it is. It was really about, how might an artist with an interest in sound look at this medical research? So that was where we sort of started. And we started, the beauty of that project were a couple of things, most importantly, that it was open-ended. So they were saying, we're not asking you to come here and fix the sound levels in this hospital, even though I did have things like a doctor come and say, can you come here and fix this door? Because that doesn't keep me awake some nights when I'm on a night shift and I go to the bed and not be having to say, well, that's not really what I travelled around the world to do. And I'm sure you have a
fix a squeaky door. That's great.
To this day, I think the success of this project, which became very successful, was that it was open-ended. And so this has become a really massively important part of my arts practice since then, was that, in my extremes of my own thinking, I think if I don't enter these spaces not knowing what's going to happen artistically, then I'm kind of colonizing it with some sort of pre-thought out thing. And if I do that, I can't address the nuance. The richness is not going to be there. There was certainly a place for that sort of work, where we know what it's going to be. I'm going to go into this space and paint 12 portraits. All that work's fabulous. There's no criticism of that work for me, but it's not the practice that I have. And I want to be in that, just like the patient might be in a different way, I want to be in that complete state of unknown or exploration together. And so it was fascinating in terms of saying, well, how might an artist explore some of these sound issues?
I'm really interested in that kind of sort of emergent approach to artistic practice. It actually reminds me of my back when I was doing my PhD. It was on complexity theory, and so this idea of kind of complexness has been something that you can't predict, you can't preempt what's going to how interactions are going to play out and what they will produce. It really reminds me of that kind of way of seeing the world. Which is fascinating. I'm also, there's so many things I wanted to cover on here. I'm really interested actually in your discussion of water allocation, the Murray-Darling water management plan. That may be something that's going to be too much to cover today, but I would love to talk to you more about that. I was also really interested in the fact that your practice seems to be very much around kind of centered in collaboration and community. That seems kind of pivotal to the way that you seem to work. So I kind of have sort of quite an open question, I suppose. I was wondering how what you did with the harmonic oscillator might have helped you to understand the relationship between the artist and their role in the environment, but also the way that you kind of understand your role as kind of interacting with others, whether that's human others or the environment.
So I think there's many ways to approach it, I think. So it's, it's interesting, my practice, especially when I place it in environments such as a medical environment. So, I'll stay on the Alder Hay work, but just to mention like my PhD work, for example, to place this sort of emergent, undefined process within a clinical space where everything is defined and everything is controlled. So the same within Alder Hay. So I amazingly had an NHS pass that said artist and I could access intensive care. But that's an extreme thing to think about. And that, the reason I went to England to do that project was because there was no way that would happen in Australia back then. 2015, I think, was my first visit. But also then, although the idea of arts and health was really well established, the idea of an artist being in intensive care was not, so that was really still unique. And so I think, I don't want to miss your question. So I think in terms of, my practice now, cannot exist without me understanding that I'm entering somewhere that's not my space. So I'm entering a hospital, engaging with a trauma that is not my trauma. And I'm there trying to figure out some relationship between my arts practice and my ethics. So that's where it lies for me. It's socially engaged practice is the term I prefer to use rather than arts and health, is about a relationship between ethics and artistic concerns. And so it's become really sort of essential that I have to be comfortable in that sort of place of the unknown, which means I then have all these other responsibilities, meeting bureaucracies and all of that. Like, these are complex. You know, we could do a whole podcast on getting ethics approval for an emergent, undefined artistic process in a clinic working with patients experiencing trauma. That's a big sort of thing. And I actually see that now as part of my practice. So I might see sound and video and performance and installation, but also that sort of negotiation. I'll think of that as part of my practice. So I think in all of if I was to think through the last 10 years of my and our work, where it's become really rich in my mind has been when we let go of the idea of the artist being the leader, and the artist being the person that has the ideas that will then present them to be celebrated as the artist, even though that still happens to an extent. But I'm saying that I've been in many situations where I've said, this thing has been made as an artist. I think it's astonishing. I think for artistic reasons, it's groundbreaking, but for ethical reasons, I can't use it. And I've done that a number of times. And I think that's a really, to maintain that, to actually just not just have that as an idea, but actually have that as a commitment, is a really different thing, because it's, in a way, you sort of feel that artistic part of you crumbling inside. But when you think ethics are a part of your practice, that glues you back together. So you're fine with it. And you realize, oh, you're actually doing something quite profound here. And because you're thinking beyond yourself. And so, does that answer your question in some sort of way?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on that very briefly. Firstly, as someone writing an ethics application for a different project right now, I can imagine, like, because they just want a lot of detail, exactly what you're going to do, and any deviation from that, you require a variation to it. So that must have been quite difficult for you to. How did you, as maybe a tip for future people going to this space, how did you navigate that? Can you give some?
Well, I first went to Sydney University's ethics committees, and I got ethics approval there. But then when I was wanting to work in the clinic directly, the Sydney local health district don't accept university ethics. But the university will accept the health district's ethics. So then I had to go to Sydney local health district ethics and put in an ethics application. And, it's quite, I've been meaning to get the exact wording and just keep it really close to it. Wording came back something like, the committee is very supportive of this innovative work of having an undefined artistic practice being the method of the research. However, can you please define it? And so, it's quite funny. And again, it was really hard, but what we sort of did, or what I just accepted at the beginning, was this is going to be a PhD of modification. And also, so I had to, when I went for that ethics approval, I had started working with a couple of patients and a doctor in the way that I could under the university's ethics. And that was sort of in a limited way. But from that, it gave me a sense of the artistic things I wanted to potentially try in the first instance. And so I was able to put those as a starting point in my local health district ethics application, and then just think, okay, but then I have a really interesting relationship. And just a really quick example is working with a patient. So I didn't have approval to use medical imagery, for example. It wasn't something that we were discussing or that I was thinking about. And there's general guidelines when you're using medical imagery around not identifying the patient, their name not being on it or anything about their condition. And so when I was working with the patient, I showed them a past work I'd made where I used a scan image to compose music, using the place where different light is to trigger frequencies. And so this patient wanted to try that with one of his scans. And I went to my PhD supervisor saying, I don't have ethical approval to do this, and so I was told, no, you can't do it. And so it's really interesting to me. So I didn't do it, but I think I wasn't ethical in that situation because I wasn't working at the best of my ability for that patient. I wasn't following the desires of that patient and what they wanted to explore, even though we could meet all those guidelines, removing, identifying features and stuff. So it's really complex because I feel I was unethical in that situation, in adhering to ethics approval.
Yeah.
It is a tricky minefield, when you're crossing arts and health, it can be very, very difficult to negotiate. And I think for us, we will be seeing you as a you know, a trailblazer in this ethical minefield and taking notes. I think you could probably set up a consultancy around it. You know, and it's so difficult to negotiate. And I think it's wonderful that, you know, just going back to the work you did at the Alder Hay, that, you know, it was something that you were able to, you know, produce and disseminate, because it's one thing being able to create those works in, you know, in a confined space, but it is just magnificent when you're able to share those works, which, you know, that project, the Harmonic Oscillator, the outputs from that project are phenomenal. I mean, there's so many different aspects of poignancy, and you know, for me it was just very, very moving. You know, I spent probably many hours, you know, just being involved in the artwork. When, you know, I told my family, I'm just popping into the study for an hour. I emerged exhausted 6 hours later, going, that was magnificent, you know. So, you know, some of the artworks that, you know, came out of that were, you know, ones like Prepared Hospital Bed, Textures of Absence, Orchestra of Tears. And we will have a link to the project on our website. And I would encourage people to set it aside longer than you expect, because you will be drawn in. It's amazing. But here today, we're going to focus on hearts. So we'd love to hear more about the piece, The Longest Heartbeat, Vic.
Yeah. The longest heartbeat, I think, you know, was something that emerged. This really supports my argument in there's no way this would have been a preconceived concept moving into the hospital space. This came from a relationship, somebody's illness and their experience. And so, you know, I was traveling back and forth to the UK for what was meant to be 2 years, but then we were able to, you know, find some more money and extend the project for nearly 5 years. And so, you know, I'd go over there pretty much twice a year. One year there was 3 trips and work in the hospital. And one day I was there and I had 3 different staff members come to me. This is a really major hospital in Liverpool in the UK. So it services a really large region, including Wales. And so it's a big hospital. The Queen came for a visit when I was there one time. Yep.
It's magnificent.
She didn't come to see me. I was like,
Oh, she did have a squeaky door she needed fixing.
yeah, a number of staff came to me saying, oh, there's this patient we really think we should meet. And so I went and met this patient, and her name's Alicia, and I have approval, you know, I have approval to use her name and speak of her sort of in that personal way. And so I went and met Alicia, and she was a 17-year-old girl who had been brought into hospital because she collapsed at school assembly. And so she collapsed not knowing she was sick. She was feeling perfectly well, collapsed assembly. That was the last time she ever walked. And so what they discovered was she had multiple cancers and they had eaten part of her spine. And she was really very, very ill. And so when she was brought into the hospital in that sort of quick amount of time, when all that sort of trauma is happening, the thing that she grabbed was her art journals. So she was a young 17-year-old aspiring artist. And so, you know, in our first meeting, we sat and looked through her journals together, and she was showing me, you know, the sort of things she was making. And so we, you know, decided in that sort of first meeting, why don't we try as much as we can to work as collaborators. So I won't be here to deliver workshops to you or to collect data from your experience. Let's just make work together wherever that goes. And so, you know, we started looking through her journals, and she had all these photographs she'd taken of textures between her home and her school that she would walk past every day on the walk to school. So they might be an up close photograph of bark on a tree, or the gravel on the road, or textures on the bricks. And so, you know, the first thing we did together was to re-photograph all those and then project them onto the white sheets of her hospital bed while she was sitting in the hospital bed she wouldn't get out of again. And so I'm not sure at that point if she knew she wouldn't walk again. She certainly didn't understand how ill she was. And so we made this really quite quickly, like our relationship was just quite sort of natural pretty quickly. And so we made this work where we projected these images over her bed, and she then just spoke. I printed them out. The images I rephotographed of the projections onto the bed, I then had printed and gave them to her, and recorded her talking about it, what it felt like. And it's astonishing because she talks about how this white, stark hospital bed in this room she's in, when we were doing this, was transformed into rivers and mountains and all of this stuff. And then, interestingly, she talks about how dark the images are and gloomy, but about how fascinating and beautiful that was. And because traditionally, when we think about arts and health, we start thinking about pastel colors and there's positive things like that. And there's something I think about when you're working with somebody that's experienced such deep trauma, to just paint that with pink is maybe missing something. But it means it becomes really careful. It's a really careful negotiation then. And so we made that work together, which just seemed really natural and beautiful. And, you hear her voice, with her Welsh accent speaking about that experience. And so then we would talk, later on in the process. So what happened was she entered palliative care pretty quickly. I can't remember exactly, but it was within a couple of months. She was still in the hospital. And, I was working with her one day. I was told she was entering palliative care, but I didn't know she had not been told. And so, I was in this situation where I was working with her thinking she knew, and I wasn't bringing it up because we were only talking about her illness when she brought up her illness. And so, but, it could have been a really terrible situation there because she hadn't been told yet. And so she was told eventually, and we started talking. I'd been doing all this work around the noises in hospital spaces and recording them and measuring them with scientifically calibrated machines and thinking about them as composition, thinking about them as being detrimental to healing. So I started thinking about the internal body sounds, the sounds that are made inside our bodies. And so I managed to get hold of a digital stethoscope. And so what that really means is that it had an output so I could record it. And so what I did was, instead of, given that these sort of internal body sounds are quite personal things, and, Alicia being a young 17-year-old girl, I taught her mum how to use them and left it with them so that they could just over time, have this sort of intimate experience, knowing at this point, everybody knowing that Alicia didn't have long left. Although they were saying it might be a couple of years. So, there's this point of just allowing or just offering this sort of intimate experience between the two to capture her recordings of her heartbeat mostly. And so I left it with them, and I actually came back to Australia. There was this one crazy year where I had to go there 3 times, and I came back just for like a couple of months because there was a project I had to do. And when I went back, she would still be in hospital. And so when I was back, I was doing research sort of separately into acoustic phenomena around the world, and in that discovered that the place on Earth where sound lasts the longest is in the north, the Highlands of Scotland, so past Inverness, in a place called Inchindown. And what I mean by sound lasting the longest is if you clap your hand, that sound, depending on the space you're in, might last for a quarter of a second or something. Inside this oil tank in Inchindown, sound lasts for 2 minutes. And so it's not an echo. So it's not thinking about it in terms of clap, 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 clap. That clap becomes a single 2-minute unit of sound. And it's, astonishing. And it had only been discovered a few years earlier. And up until that point, the sort of longest sound place, longest acoustic space we had was around 45 seconds, I think, in a mausoleum in Scotland. And so I started thinking about what it would mean to take a recording of Alicia's heartbeat, being a heart that didn't have long left to beat in this world, and to take it to this place and to play it in this space and re-record it, in effect having the longest heartbeat in history, a single heartbeat to last for 2 minutes. And so I was in Australia when I thought of that. And so I spoke to Clive, who I was working with at Manchester, because of course all these sort of moments are filled with so much combination of fear and excitement. Can I broach this with her? Can I, And so when I traveled back, I met with her and her family, and I told her about this idea, and she loved it. So she was saying, I'm going to have the longest heartbeat in history. And, super excited about this sort of thought of her heart, and sad that she couldn't travel with us, of course. And so it took me quite a while to track down the owners of this location. So what it was in between World War I and World War II, the British Navy had, in secret, built these large oil tanks buried in the Highlands in Scotland, and their purpose was to store oil for the British Navy. So if their oil deposits were bombed, they could still. And so it was in this place, which is now private property, and from these highlands there was an underground pipe that attached to the port. That was many, many, many miles. And so I tracked down the owners and I told them what I was doing, and they gave me permission to come up there and do this. At that point, the only other people that had been in there were the Guinness Book of Records to do a calibrated test to prove that it has a 2-minute reverb time, and a Japanese television show. So Clive and I, asked Clive if he wanted to come, and so he was super excited about that. So he, with all of Alicia's, best wishes, we traveled up there and, had to do a lot of planning in terms of finding battery-powered speakers and torches and equipment. And we traveled there, and, to get into this space, we first had to walk down a tunnel that was around 250 meters long, roughly, from memory. And then we had to be pushed through a pipe that was around 45 centimeters wide to fall into this pitch black, oil-covered tunnel. And we had one little head torch each and one handheld torch to share, and a bunch of sort of medical sound equipment. And it was quite sort of petrifying. Clive begged to go in first and to be the last to leave. So, I let him have that honor. And he got pushed in, and I turned to the owner, as he was sort of pushing us through, saying, I'm petrified, because I felt petrified. I said, I don't think I could fit through there. And he was just sort of a bit kind of nonchalant about it, saying, get in. Of course, he'd never been in there himself. So. And so we got into this space, and, we wore sort of white overall, disposable overalls, and he had given us like shower caps for your shoes, protect your shoes, but, they came off in 2 steps. We just found ourselves in this pitch black space, which when we went in, you would just say, and that would just sort of sing for 2 minutes. As Clive described it when we went in there, it was like hearing diamonds, was how he described the sound. And it was quite astonishing, just, this movement that would happen, and it's a movement sort of round, but also up and down, and this complexity in the sound that would just, from any noise, if you bump something, scrape something, you'd have to wait for 2 minutes to get sound. And so we first had to let's try and walk to the end to see what's here. Well, so we did that and came back, and then we set up all of our equipment, and I set up microphones sort of down the space. And it was really slow. We were in there for about 6 hours and more, maybe. There's all things like I would go to the first set of microphones, and Clive would be up there, and I'd call out, okay, press play. But then I have to wait for 2 minutes for that to stop, and I have to check levels. And we figured out a way to communicate via torch clicks and that kind of thing. But then once we were set up, we played, single heartbeats, so just boom, boom. But then also just long recordings of Alicia's heartbeat. And it was astonishing. It was like life-changing hearing this kind of thing. It was really, we took this recording of somebody's heartbeat, and it felt when we were traveling up there that we were carrying this really special cargo. But actually what we were carrying was a digital file. It was binary, it's ones and zeros, it's a digital file. Yet it felt like we were carrying her heartbeat. We understood the immensity of this in terms of her palliative care, in terms of the fact this sound of her heartbeat will not be heard soon. This it's quite an intense thing. And it's just recently I've really been thinking about that aspect of it was just a digital file, yet it held all its materiality and, all of its emotion within it. And so we played it, and it was just astonishing the way it sort of reverberated the way, you know, as you're getting to the end of that 2 minutes, there'd often be those moments where you think, oh, it's gone. Oh, no, there it is, listening for that moment when sound stops. And it's often not as soon as you think. It's still there, lingering on. And so, you know, we had all these plans to sing and do all these other recordings when we were there, but that all just went out the window. It became such a moving experience, but also it took so long to do it. You know, that's what we were able to achieve when we were in there, these recordings of her heartbeat. And so when the owners were with us, there was a sort of young guy and his grandfather, I think. And the grandfather was lovely, but a bit like, I don't know what you're doing. You're just wasting my time, really. You know, a bit gruff like that, a bit disinterested. He went off for a wander, but he came in and talking through this pipe, he could hear the heartbeat outside. So he came in saying to us something like, the wee lassie's heartbeat is embodying the Highlands. And we were just silent because we just had this experience and just thinking about, you know, Alicia's heartbeat moving through all that soil and earth and the worms and the rocks, you know, out into that landscape where this man who sort of didn't particularly care about why we were there came in moved because outside the Highlands beated with a heartbeat, the longest heartbeat in history. And so, you know, we did that, and then I was leaving straight after that. So I flew to London and with shoes covered in oil, and then went home. And that was when I was coming back quite quickly. So the deal I had with Alicia was that, you know, I'd come back, would listen to it, and we'll just talk about, well, what next? What do we do with this astonishing sound? So we came back, and I didn't listen to it again after we left there because it had such big impact on me. I thought, I can't listen to this flippantly. I have to leave it. And then when I got home, I received an email from Alicia's mother saying she'd passed away. And so she never got to hear her heartbeat, this world's longest heartbeat. And so, you know, I then had this moment of, oh, what do I do now? Do I write back to Alicia's mum saying, do you want to hear it? You know, and so that's what I did. But Clive and I would have long conversations about, I'll send it in the morning when I don't want to send it at night in England in case it upsets her and then she can't sleep. I better send it in the morning so then at least she can go out. And so she said that she wanted to hear it. And so we sent it to her. And, you know, really that became, for the next few years, I kept traveling back to England, and every time I met with her, every time I presented this work publicly in talks or exhibitions over there, her and her family would travel. And so this sort of idea of this 2-minute long heartbeat became something around we could explore grief and the loss of somebody in their family.
I really understand why you didn't want to just, you know, listen on the fly to that sound, because it you know, without being over dramatic or overgrown, but it really was, you know, such a moving and honorable piece. You know, you really taken a piece of this person with you. I know you're talking about the file, but you know, for our listeners, if you go to the website and click on that art piece, you'll understand what we're talking about, you know, and the huge need to respect that recording. So, you know, the sounds and sights in that piece are very moving. And I'm sort of using that word in moving in the early modern sense, that the passions have the power both to move us physically and emotionally to a different state. And for me, that happened about 4 minutes into this piece, that the film of this project, The Longest Heartbeat. And it's just when Alicia is speaking and when this background music begins. And I'm not sure if this was what the sound was, but for me, it sounded like asystole on a monitor, which is when the heartbeat stops. And it's a very particular sound. And I found that incredibly sad, really moving. And, you know, in like the efforts of research, I thought you need to stop here and try and work out, you know, why this is happening to you, you know, because again, I wanted to dig deeper into this piece of work because it is so moving. So for me, I thought about it, and I think it was that bridge between Alicia's careful but animated description of her work. Her voice is very careful and very soft, and but she's within that softness and that care, she is very animated about the art she's creating. And then there was the reality of her context competing in that space. And, it's not that when you're working in that critical care space that you don't have empathy with your patients, because of course you do. I mean, you really do. You engage with that patient on a very empathetic level. But you also, I think, sometimes need to separate the physical context that's brought them into the critical care situation. And I think that sound in the middle of the piece really made that emotional bridge for me, because sometimes it's that bridge that you don't want to cross over. So you are very empathetic and you are very in tune with the person in front of you, but what's happening to the person you keep over here so that you can work. And I think that's important. So I think that was a wonderful moment for me in that piece. So I really do appreciate that, Vic.
Yeah, thanks. And it wasn't, that wasn't what that sound was. So, the soundtrack that you hear underneath is just a recording of the ward in the hospital, but it's slowed down. And so
Yeah.
it slowed down, kind of reference that idea of all the waiting that happens and the shift in time being actually not linear when you're experiencing major illness. But it had that effect, which wasn't intentional at all, and elongating some of those
Yeah.
beats, which are what we're talking about, I think. And so,
It's fascinating, Vic. Like, I think when you're talking before about that feeling of carrying the weight of Alicia's heartbeat, even though physically, not even physically, digitally, it's a file, right? It comes back to like Claire and I have talked about how important the pulse is to life, and it's something that's actually reflected in a lot of your other works. There's this pulsing light that's through some of your other works as well. And we'll have some links, obviously, in the show notes to all of your works for this project. But I guess, can you summarize to you how important is the heart and its pulse and beat in your works, both in that project, but just in general?
Well, I think there is a lot of heart imagery in the whole body of works, I think, and that was unintentional. That wasn't intentional for a second, but in reflecting on that, I think, when I'm in the hospital space, the heart plays many roles. So the heart is, a practical concern, brain function, the heart, are the main sort of objectives of the medical clinician to try to keep these things going, to keep them alive, to keep them pumping, to the things. But the heart is also much more than that. It's also a symbol of love, of loss, of emotion, of those other aspects of illness that go beyond the biomedical. And so I think, to me, actually using an image like the heart speaks to that, because I enter into spaces that are biomedical spaces that, I'm not doing my work in antagonism to biomedicine, but in relationship to it and in partnership with it. And I think the heart is actually a really great symbol or metaphor or something for, the effective aspect of what I'm doing, and actually the practical aspect. I don't want my work to be guided by the practical aspect, but the practical aspect is a part of it. A health economist from Alder came and gave me just completely out of the blue. I had never engaged with her. She came and found me and told me that Alicia didn't eat when she was in hospital, and often more than 2 staff would have to be with her for a long time with every meal. And they calculated something like, I'd saved the hospital, I think it was £15,000, because when I worked with Alicia, she ate. And so somebody else externally is putting this sort of financial figure on it. And I think, I'm not anti that, but it's not my aim. But then what I argue is, you allow an open-ended, genuine artistic process to happen, you will find all of these benefits. A health economist can find this benefit, as well as Alicia's mother being able to say, this is impacting my grieving process. So these are amazing combination of things to bring together: an economic benefit and and something as personal as grief, exploring grief. And so I think maybe when the heart started emerging, I did have a little moment of, oh, maybe that's just some teenage iconography and I need to get rid of it. but then very quickly realized this is the heart of the matter, you know. And in preparation for this, I went and reread my honors thesis, and I noticed how many times I used the word at the heart of this, meaning the center, you know, and I don't think I'd really realized that before. If we think about that being a center, it does allow me then, as you just pointed out, to then think about the work that I do that's not in a health space with communities around water systems, around the Menindee Fish Kill event. You know, we did an astonishing project with communities after that fish kill event with Department of Primary Industries and the Barkindji people and Wiradjuri people. This is an extension of that kind of pulse that you're talking about. You know, this is, to me, they're all the same. Whether if I work in a clinic or on the river, I'm doing the same type of project. I'm working with people with their life. It has some health outcomes. It might have some mental health outcomes. It nearly always impacts the way we communicate as human beings. And how astonishing a child noticed his dad didn't punch this guy for once. It's astonishing. As well as the clinicians, you know, I remember being at Alder and having a doctor yell at when I was introduced to him, and him yelling across the ward, what the fuck is he doing here? Because he was so angry at the idea that an artist was in this space. And so then you think, you know, you can understand that there might be resistances because it's such an unusual concept, but in what sort of workplace is that an acceptable way to communicate? It's actually not in any workplace. And so I think, you know, the heart is a really good way for me to think about the effective and the practical qualities of the work that I'm doing. That we can talk about the emotional aspect of illness and the economic aspect of illness, or we can talk about, you know, what care means in terms of our emotional needs of care and what are the, you know, financial or bureaucratic or hierarchical barriers to providing care for somebody. And so I think it's, you know, it is that pulse. I just have to, you know, place my hand on my body to remember that I have one, and it's moving and it's doing this work for me. But then I can use it emotionally. I can feel brokenhearted, which maybe isn't a medical condition. Maybe it is. I don't know. So I think it's become really central to the work.
We have so much to say on brokenhearted syndrome, pulselessness.
Sure.
It is a deep dive of fascinating work. That's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really struck by the way that what you do kind of entangles multiple ways of thinking and being. So the way that you kind of integrate environmental experiences with the body, with emotions, and that example of the heartbeat is something both kind of material and intangible. Alicia's heartbeat, that's very striking and very moving. It gives me lots to think about. This work is incredible, and I want now to turn to a little bit to some of your more recent and ongoing works, kind of have a think about where it is and where it's going. Personally, and the reason I've kind of mentioned environments a couple of times is because I work a lot with ideas of place and eco-criticism in literature. So I was drawn to that aspect of your work. Things like haunting. I was rewatching that this morning, and again that idea of using place to extend the length of Alicia's heartbeat, and that the way that it was embodied in the Highlands. That kind of intersection between body and emotional environment I find fascinating. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your newer work, and if you want to touch on those links that I was talking about as well. But we're interested to see where everything is now, where it's going.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, a lot of my focus is on my PhD. It's due in 4 months. You know, I'm at that point.
The business end.
Taking time.
Yes, thank you.
I want to make a list of all the other things I did whilst doing it. I think when I was, you know, making the decision to do a PhD, I think it came about when I was presenting the work that came from Alder. I was invited to show that at the Tate in Liverpool. And so when I was doing that, I had people come up to me and say, this is a fabulous PhD outcome. And I was saying, oh, it's not part of a PhD. But it's, I didn't think I had an interest to continue and do a PhD, but I started thinking through my practice and thinking there is just all these elements already embedded in my practice that make sense that I continue and do a PhD. But my big struggle, because I was in no rush to do it, so I just let it find itself. But my big sort of what I kept going back and forth between was, should I be undertaking a PhD in environmental humanities or in this like deeply in a clinical space? And really what I wanted to do was to bring those two worlds together, but I didn't feel ready for that yet. And so I thought I've been, so much of my work has been focused in the area of environmental humanities that then this opportunity to work at the facial nerve clinic came up, which is, astonishing, the idea of working with people whose faces don't function as we expect. And so that's just where I sort of landed, thinking, oh, my next stage is about bringing these things together. And so, there's so much of my work, like haunting, for example. So that, that came from, that's currently on tour as a visual arts exhibition at the moment. So it's currently in the Blue Mountains in Sydney. It goes to South Australia next and then to the National Museum in Canberra. Which again is the first, it's the first solo exhibition from a non-Indigenous contemporary artist ever to happen at the National Museum. So that idea of contemporary art working with social history actually is quite an emerging idea, surprisingly. And so, that project was one where I took images of objects from the National Museum collection. So things that are sitting behind glass, kind of disembodied. They have a panel that tell this story. And so, for example, in the National Museum, they had this pyramid of wheat samples, and they were made by William Farrer, who was on our old $2 note, the green $2 note. And, in working with the curators at the National Museum, I was told about how William Farrer developing these wheat samples allowed agriculture to move inland into regional Australia. So I live in Narrandera on the Murrumbidgee River, and the Murrumbidgee actually starts up near Canberra, so not far from the National Museum. And William Farrer had his little laboratory on the banks of the Murrumbidgee River, so which is now a historic homestead. And so, we started thinking about how in this national story at the National Museum, we celebrate William Farrer for the development of these wheat seeds. But the other side of that story is about, loss of culture through genocide, through land loss, the same for species and land, and, the conditions of our landscape out there. And so we wanted to try to have that conversation, again, not in antagonism with that old history. And I think that's one of the complexities of the work we often do, is we're trying to have the conversations together. We're saying we are celebrating this because we do rely on this agriculture, but we must include these other conversations. And so during that process, I collected a number of objects and photographed them, and then wanted to project them into fog that came down the Murrumbidgee, and in order to see what happened to those images and then re-photograph them. And so we got permission to work at William Farrer's historic homestead, and the National Museum did an astonishing thing, which was set up a massive, very expensive projector in a weatherproof enclosure for 3 months on this property. So I just had to travel there and plug in my laptop and sit and work. And the owners knew I'd be turning up at 2 a.m. and all this sort of stuff. And so the idea was that, I wanted to work in collaboration with ephemeral environmental conditions that I couldn't control. And then I wanted to see what would happen to these images. And I was expecting what I was going to get were kind of abstract paintings. I wanted to paint with light into this fog. And we traveled there for 2 months. And the curator, George Main, again, has become a really close friend, would come with me. And so he had days where he'd come till dawn and be with me at the river till dawn, then go to the National Museum and work. It was quite a commitment we did over more than 2 months doing that and not getting any fog at all. And so it wasn't until the sort of last month where on a few occasions we got fog and were able to capture these astonishing images from these objects. And so after the first night we got fog, and I had these images and I was looking at them again on my laptop in this sort of digital world. There was so much emotion in them. And there was a photograph of a piece of railway bridge that they have at the National Museum. And that railway bridge was from Wagga Wagga. And it was really talking about how, because of this development of agriculture, next we needed the infrastructure to move things in a more efficient way. So the rail system was built. And I took those images to show them to Arnie Faye Clayton, who's an elder in Wagga, who I know and who we've worked with before. And I went to her house and was showing her, because I had one of her images, one of her paintings that I was projecting into fog as well. And I was showing her that, which she loved. But then I showed her the images of the railway bridge in the fog and a video of that work. And she just started crying. And she talked about how, you know, she was taken to Cootamundra Girls' Home to be a house assistant or a slave, as you might correctly term it. And, you know, a lot of her artworks, the artwork of hers that I projected into fog was about that girls' home that she was taken to and about the experience of being stolen. So when I showed her the railway bridge object, you know, she was saying, that bridge is no longer there, but I was taken over that bridge on a train to the Cootamundra Girls' Home. I grew up thinking that the rail system only existed to take Aboriginal children away. So that's what she thought the rail system was for. And then she said, she was just sat watching it, and, you know, soft tears were falling. And she said, I've lived my life in a fog because of what happened to me. And so it was this, again, you know, I can talk about these sorts of things in the Alder Hay work or on the facial nerve work, that I'm now with this wheat. I start with a wheat seed sample and with an iconic figure who was on a $2 note. And here I am sitting in the house of an elder who's crying at an image of a railway bridge. So I would propose that maybe her relationship would be different if she just went and looked at that railway bridge section behind glass at the National Museum. And so, you know, this is what we're trying to do, evoke this sort of emotion through this kind of work. And I'm going to go back to Alder Hay just for 1 second, because when I was showing that work at the Tate in Liverpool, and Alicia's heartbeat was there in the video that you've referred to, and people could actually, I'd made this box with a heart-shaped button that people could hold this box and press it, and it would play the 2-minute heartbeat. But you'd also feel a little vibration in the box that was somewhat similar to that. But because I was in the Tate and it was all quite extraordinary, you know, I stopped knowing I was the artist, just seeing how they were. And what I noticed was a number of people crying. And so then it was this sort of sense of responsibility. How do I deal with that? So I would just spend my days there, and if somebody reacted like that, go and speak to them. And I remember having an amazing conversation with this man who was just sitting there sobbing, and I sat with him and we talked, and he said to me, well, just as I was, you know, wanting to apologize, he said to me, this is what art should do. It should make me feel this much emotion. And so on every instance, all the people that cried in that exhibition, nobody cried in a sense of trauma that was uncontrollable, or cried in a way that made me question the ethics of sharing it. You know, was I pushing this too far? Was I, everybody was sort of grateful for having this big experience. You know, I remember this tough English bloke coming up going, hey, are you the artist? And me sort of feeling a bit scared, what's he going to do? And he just gave me a big hug. And I was like, oh, and he just went, thanks, mate, and just walked off. And, you know, these experiences are really, really meaningful for me, because I'm often questioning, how can I take that thing I feel in a oil tank, or how can I take this thing I feel on a river at 3 a.m. in fog and take it into a gallery, which is nearly as controlled as a hospital, and try to, like, how do I extend that feeling across? And I think, you know, I've been trying to do that for the last 12 years of my practice. And I feel like it's in the last sort of 6 or 8 years where I feel like there is a way to do it. We're able to do it in some ways, and I can't define it or give a framework for it, but there is a way. And so what that's doing for me is bringing that sense of place, the touch of the fog on my skin, the coldness, whatever it is I'm feeling, and in some way allows me to convey that stuff in a confined, controlled space. And I think that's, you know, that's all, that again, the embedding of artists in all portfolio areas, and this sort of idea that we're not separate from place in everything we're doing, are the two things that are really at the heart of all of this. And I said at the heart again.
No, what I loved, you just tied everything together that we've talked about today in a lovely closing statement. That was fantastic.
Yes, I think that is just such a wonderful point to finish our conversation, Vic. We are so thankful. It has been an amazing amazing discussion this morning. Again, I'm quite moved. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. It was been lovely to talk through it all. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic.
So thank you, everyone. That's the end of another podcast for Heart of the Matter. Goodbye from us, and we'll see you at the next one.